Only 17, seriously. Logan Pierce laughed right in her face. Not a small laugh, a loud, chest-deep laugh that made every Navy SEAL in the room turn and look. Cole Rourke didn't even bother learning her name. He just pointed at the door. Observation deck, upstairs. That's where spectators go. 17 years old, 115 pounds, standing alone in a room full of combat veterans who had collectively survived more wars than she had years on this earth. She reached into her bag, pulled out her qualification papers, and placed them in Rourke's hand. And I didn't come to watch. 72 hours later, she tripled their best score. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Maddie Hale arrived at the Red Mesa Precision Training Facility. The Arizona desert was already doing what Arizona deserts do in July. It was trying to kill everything living inside it. The sun had been up for barely 2 hours, and the thermometer outside the main gate already read 104 degrees. The tarmac shimmered. The rocks along the perimeter fence radiated heat like a cast iron skillet pulled straight off a burner. Dust devils spun and died along the ridgeline. Everything smelled like dry earth and gun oil and something faintly chemical that came from the target systems running diagnostics in the distance. Red Mesa was not a public facility. It was not on any map that a civilian could purchase. It was operated jointly by a private defense contractor and a special advisory board that included 3 retired generals, a former CIA station chief, and enough active duty liaison officers to staff a small forward operating base. The precision trial held there every 18 months was considered by people who knew such thing to be the most rigorous long-range marksmanship evaluation outside of classified military programs. To be invited was unusual. To attend was a privilege. To perform well was the kind of thing that got mentioned quietly in rooms where careers were made. Maddie Hale arrived in a dusty pickup truck, driven by a man she had never met, a civilian transport contractor who had picked her up from a Phoenix hotel at 4:30 in the morning without asking her a single question. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder, a rifle case in her right hand, and she was wearing the same thing she wore to every competition. Dark range pants, a plain gray long-sleeve shirt, and boots that had been resoled twice because she refused to break in a new pair before an important shoot. She was 17 years and 4 months old. She checked in at the front gate, showed her credentials, accepted a facility badge, and walked into the main briefing building alone. The room was already full. 14 men were seated at metal folding tables arranged in 2 rows. Most of them wore desert pattern training gear. Several had coffee. They were talking among themselves with the casual ease of people who had been in rooms like this 100 times. Men who had been shot at on multiple continents and returned home intact and were therefore constitutionally incapable of feeling nervous about a training exercise. Maddie found a seat near the left wall, set her rifle case against it, and placed her duffel on the floor. She did not introduce herself. She did not smile around the room. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, uncapped a pen, and waited for the briefing to begin. Nobody paid her any attention. Not yet. Cole Rourke walked in at exactly 0700, which was when he had said he would walk in, and nobody who had ever worked with him was surprised by that. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had decided somewhere in his 40s that his body was a tool and tools required maintenance, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked less like skin and more like the surface of a well-used leather belt. He had 32 years in the Navy, the last 12 as a Master Chief in SEAL team operations, and he had transitioned into private defense consulting without any visible adjustment period because his personality had always been more or less identical to his job description. He stood at the front of the room, set a tablet on the lectern, and looked at the group. His eyes landed on Maddie immediately. He looked at her the way you look at something that shouldn't be there. A coffee cup left on a control panel, a chair blocking an exit. Not hostile exactly, more like genuinely confused. "Who are you?" he said. It was not unkind, it was simply direct. It was the voice of a man who had spent 3 decades asking questions and receiving immediate, accurate answers. Maddie looked up from her notebook. "Maddie Hale, I'm registered for the trial." The room got a little quieter. Rourke's expression did not change. "How old are you?" 17. A pause. From the second row, Logan Pierce, Petty Officer, First Class, SEAL, the kind of physically perfect human specimen who had been athletic since birth and had never stopped being reminded of it by everyone around him, let out a short laugh. Not a cruel laugh, an honestly surprised one. 17, he repeated like the number was funny on its own. Another man, Rourke's senior assistant, a former JSOC operator, named Webb, leaned sideways toward Pierce and said, not especially quietly, "She bring a permission slip." Low laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Rourke held up one hand and the room settled. He walked to his tablet, scrolled briefly, looked up again. "Hell," he said, "Arizona Junior State Champion, 3 consecutive years. Open civilian precision record, semi-arid conditions confirmed at 16 under international supervision. General Brooks's personal invitation." He said it without expression. He might have been reading a parts list. "The observation deck is on the second floor," he said. "If you're here to watch, that's where guests go." Maddie had already put her pen down. She reached into her duffel bag, pulled out a folded envelope, and held it toward him across the table. She did not get up. She did not raise her voice. "I'm not here to watch," she said. Rourke crossed the room, took the envelope, opened it, and read it. He read it again. Inside were her official qualification papers, signed, countersigned, and bearing the seal of the Red Mesa Program Advisory Board. Her invitation had not come through a standard application. General Nathaniel Brooks, a retired 4-star Marine who sat on the board and whose opinion of Rourke's program was one of the few opinions Rourke had ever modified his behavior to accommodate, had personally reviewed her record and issued the invitation 4 months ago. Rourke folded the papers, replaced them in the envelope, and handed it back. "All right," he said. "You're in." He turned back to the room and began the briefing. But the laughter from the second row hadn't quite finished dying, and Rourke, who heard everything, who had always heard everything, did nothing to stop it. That silence told Maddie exactly what she needed to know about the next 72 hours. She wrote 2 words in her notebook, underlined them once. They already decided. The opening briefing lasted 45 minutes and covered the structure of the trial, 3 phases over 3 days. Each one scored electronically. Each one designed to test a different dimension of precision marksmanship. Phase 1 was long-range accuracy under physical stress. Phase 2 was judgment and target discrimination in a complex environment. Phase 3 was the full integration, everything at once, under conditions that would be deliberately worsened by the range staff. The scoring was cumulative. Penalties subtracted from totals. The electronic head zone, a roughly 3-inch circle at the center of each target's silhouette, was worth double points. Body zone hits scored normally. Friendly marker strikes zeroed your entire run. Rourke went through it with the flat efficiency of a man who had delivered this briefing 17 times and saw no reason to vary it. When he finished, he asked if there were questions. Pierce raised his hand. "Are all weight restrictions standard?" "For most participants, yes," Rourke said. "Ms. Hale will be operating under modified load parameters per program safety guidelines." Pierce nodded slowly, processing this, and then without any particular venom, which was almost worse, said, "So we're carrying full kit and she's carrying what exactly?" "A modified kit," Rourke said. "Right." Pierce glanced at the man beside him. "That seems fair." It was said casually, conversationally, the way men say things when they want the comment to land without being responsible for where it lands. Maddie heard it. She wrote nothing. She did not look at Pierce. She was already thinking about the wind report she had read that morning. Pressure gradient from the southwest 8 to 12 miles per hour at surface level, but the topographic maps she had studied showed a canyon system on the range's north side that would create a compression effect. The surface reading would be unreliable. The range computers would compensate for recorded wind data, but recorded data lagged real conditions by at least 40 seconds at distance. She would need to read it herself. She always did. After the briefing, the group moved to the staging area. Equipment was checked, zeroed, and logged. The Barrett .50 caliber training rifles, heavy, powerful, chambered for subsonic rounds in this configuration to reduce certain range hazards, were assigned and confirmed. Maddie's rifle had already been set up to her specifications, which she had submitted in advance. The armorer who handed it to her looked at her age, looked at the rifle, and visibly decided not to say anything. She appreciated that. The veterans assembled in groups, double-checking equipment with the practiced, comfortable efficiency of people doing something they had done thousands of times. Some of them had worked together before. There was easy conversation, the shorthand of professionals who shared a common language. Maddie prepared her equipment alone. This was not social exclusion exactly. Nobody told her she couldn't join a group. It was more like a natural arrangement of orbits, everyone gravitating toward their own kind, and Maddie existing in a category that had no natural orbit in this particular environment. She had experienced this before, at regional competitions when she was 13, and every other shooter was at least twice her age. At training clinics where the instructor had once spent 20 minutes explaining grip technique that she had mastered at 11. At every event where her presence required people to do a small mental calculation they hadn't anticipated having to do. She had stopped being frustrated by it somewhere around her 15th year. Now she simply treated it as information. If they didn't expect much from her, she didn't have to manage their expectations. She could just shoot. The range master called the group to attention at 0900. Phase 1 was beginning. The physical endurance component was 8 miles of broken terrain, rocky desert scrubland with elevation changes that looked modest on paper and felt punishing underfoot. The route was not a trail, it was a designated course marked by GPS coordinates and orange flags crossing dry riverbeds, loose shale slopes, and sections of open ground that offered no shade and no shelter from the sun, which by mid-morning had reached 109 degrees. Each competitor carried their equipment. The veterans carried full kit rifle optics, ammunition hydration, field medical, communications. Maddie's load was reduced per the safety protocol. She carried her rifle optics, essential hydration, and a reduced ammunition complement. It was still approximately 42 pounds. She had trained with 60. But training on a range in the early morning hours outside Tucson was not the same thing as carrying weight across 8 miles of Arizona desert in July heat. While the sun pressed down on you like a physical object and the terrain did everything in its power to turn your ankles and steal your energy and make you feel somewhere around the 3rd mile like the entire concept of movement was something you had misunderstood. Maddie struggled. She knew she would. She had accepted it in advance. She wasn't the fastest. She wasn't the strongest. She finished the 8-mile approach roughly 19 minutes behind the lead group. Several veterans had already reached the firing position, set up, and consumed water before she arrived. Pierce was already prone behind his rifle when she crested the final ridge, and he glanced back at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be contemptuous and not quite managing it. Rourke was standing at the position with a stopwatch and a tablet. He said nothing when she arrived. He didn't need to. The stopwatch spoke. Maddie found her position, set up her equipment with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be after that approach, and began her breathing sequence. Her father had taught it to her when she was 9 years old. 3 slow breaths in, hold 4 seconds, release in 7, repeat 3 times, let the heart rate drop. Let the tunnel vision of exhaustion soften into something broader, more aware. Pain is information, he used to tell her. Listen to it. Let it show you what your body is doing, but don't let it make the decision. You make the decision. Daniel Hale had been a competitive marksman for 23 years. He had taught his daughter to shoot before she could ride a bicycle without training wheels. He had died of a cardiac event 2 years ago at 53 in the middle of a morning training session on the range behind their house. He had not suffered. He had simply stopped. Maddie had found him. She did not talk about this. She had talked about it once to a sports psychologist recommended by a competition association and had found the experience useful in the way that an oil change is useful, necessary maintenance that doesn't change who you are. She had learned that grief, like pain, was information. You acknowledged it. You let it exist. You did not give it the controls. She settled behind the Barrett. Through the scope, the first target appeared at 600 yards, an electronic hostile silhouette partially visible against a rocky background. The wind was doing something interesting. At this distance, the surface movement she had measured walking in told her one thing. But the heat mirage, that shimmering distortion above the ground where hot air and cooler air argued with each other at the boundary, was traveling in the opposite direction. The range computer had already populated a recommended firing solution on the display mounted to her left. Maddie looked at it. She looked at the mirage. Rourke spoke from behind her. Computer's giving you a clean solution. Conditions support it. She understood what he was doing. He was not helping her. He was testing whether she would defer to the machine instead of her own assessment. It was a legitimate test. Machines were reliable. Machines aggregated data from multiple sensors. Machines did not have bad days or sore shoulders or the emotional weight of knowing that 19 men were watching you and had already decided what the outcome would be. But machines read yesterday's data. Machines averaged. Machines didn't see the mirage. The mirage is going the other way, Maddie said quietly. Wind sensors are on the surface. The mirage is showing me what's happening at flight path level. A pause. That's a significant deviation from the recommended solution, Rourke said. I know. Another pause. Longer. Your call, he said. She adjusted her elevation, applied her wind correction, set her natural point of aim, took 3 slow breaths, fired. The electronic range display, a large screen visible to all competitors and observers, registered the hit location. Dead center, head zone, perfect score. The observation area where several range officials and a few visiting advisors had gathered went quiet in a way that quiet doesn't usually go. It was not the absence of conversation. It was the presence of something unexpected, absorbing all the available attention in the room. Pierce, 2 positions down, muttered, something that Maddie couldn't hear. Rourke said nothing. Maddie cycled the action, located the second target at 900 yards, and began her assessment again. By the time she reached the 5th target, 1,050 yards, partial concealment, crosswind layer, she identified from a dust plume created by a range vehicle. She had been watching in her peripheral vision. The veterans had begun to pay a different quality of attention. Not admiration, not yet. These were not men who arrived at admiration quickly, and they were right not to. One good string didn't change the calculus of experience, but the casual dismissal had shifted into something more watchful. Pierce had stopped talking. Webb, who had made the permission slip comment, was standing with his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly forward, the posture of a man who is watching something he hasn't fully categorized yet. Rourke, who stood behind the line with his tablet in his stopwatch, in his expression that revealed absolutely nothing, watched every shot and wrote nothing down. This in itself was notable. Rourke always wrote things down. Maddie completed her first phase string. She hit every target. She came in behind most of the men on time. The physical approach had cost her there, and that was real, and she accepted it. But she had hit every single target, including the final one, at 1,400 yards where the wind had shifted between her first sight picture and the moment of firing, and she had adjusted mid-breath and sent the round anyway. The electronic display showed her running score. Several of the veterans looked at it for a long moment. Pierce took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and put it back on. Huh, he said. Just that, one syllable. It was Maddie would later think the most honest thing he said all day. Rourke called a water break. Maddie sat on a low rock wall at the edge of the staging area, drinking steadily, letting her heart rate continue its descent. Her shoulders ached from the approach. Her boots had, as predicted, filled with fine sand somewhere around mile 4, and she had stopped to empty them twice rather than develop blisters, which had cost her time but saved her stability. She was calculating whether the trade was worth it. It was when a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. She looked up. Webb was standing there. He had his water bottle in one hand and the expression of a man who is making a social decision in real time. That correction on target 5, he said, the dust plume thing. Were you watching the vehicle the whole time, or did you just catch it in the moment? Maddie considered him. He was asking a real question. Not a setup, not a trap. She could tell the difference. I noticed it when we set up, she said. If there's vehicle traffic on the range during a shoot, you track it. Moving weight disturbs surface air. You can use it. Webb processed this. We don't usually have vehicle traffic during phase 1. There was a range maintenance truck that came through on the south perimeter road at 0947, Maddie said. I saw it on the approach. A longer pause. You were tracking a truck on a perimeter road while you were carrying 40 pounds uphill in 109 degrees, Webb said. I was tracking everything on the range, Maddie said. That's the job. Webb looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, a small, controlled nod, the kind that men give when they've received information they need to think about privately, and walked away. Rourke called the group back to position for the phase 1 debrief. He stood in front of them with his tablet And for the first time since the briefing that morning, he did not immediately speak, Mish, when he had everyone's attention. He let the silence sit for a count of 3. Rourke never did that by accident. Phase 1 scores are logged, he said. Individual feedback tomorrow. What I'll tell you collectively right now is that the conditions today were not standard. Wind variance was higher than forecast. Several of you made corrections. Some of those corrections were effective, some were not. He paused. One competitor made corrections that the range system did not recommend. He did not look at Maddie. He didn't need to. Every man in the group already knew who he meant. Those corrections were correct, Rourke said. Another pause. Shorter. We'll begin phase 2 at 0600 tomorrow. Dismissed. He turned away and began speaking with a range official. And Logan Pierce, who had laughed first, who had made the permission slip joke, who had muttered something Maddie couldn't hear after her first shot, stood very still for a moment in the afternoon heat. Then he turned toward where Maddie was gathering her equipment. He didn't say anything, but he watched. And watching for a man like Pierce was where the real change always began. The evening came the way Arizona evenings do, sudden and purple, and briefly cool, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in 40 minutes, as the sun hit the horizon and the desert remembered that it was also capable of something other than punishment. The competitors were housed in a facility dormitory, a long concrete building with individual rooms that were functional without being comfortable, which was exactly appropriate for the purpose. Maddie sat at the small desk in her room with a topographic map spread across it. The map was marked in pencil, not her pencil, her father's. She had inherited his maps along with his equipment and his careful, precise handwriting in their margins, noting wind patterns, elevation corrections, environmental observations from ranges he had visited across the country. Red Mesa was on this map. Her father had visited this facility once 7 years ago. He had come not as a competitor, but as a consultant, presenting a methodology he had developed for reading environmental cues at ultra-long range, a system that combined traditional mirage reading with vegetation analysis, dust tracking, and target motion prediction into something he called environmental integration. It was by any objective measure a significant advance over standard practice. The program director at the time, not Rourke, his predecessor, had reviewed the methodology and declined to implement it. The feedback, as her father had reported it to her, was polite and specific. The methodology was interesting, but without a military background or institutional credentials, the program could not formally adopt techniques from a civilian source. The liability was too complex. The optics were complicated. Maybe someday. Her father had driven home, cooked dinner, and said almost nothing about it. He was not a man who expressed bitterness easily. He had simply filed the experience away and continued his work. 2 years later, he was gone. And 7 years later, his daughter was sitting in a room at Red Mesa, looking at his handwriting on a map, about to prove that what he had built was real. She was not here for revenge. She had examined that impulse carefully, the way her father had taught her to examine all impulses with curiosity rather than judgment, and she had concluded that it was not revenge she wanted. Revenge required the other person to suffer. She did not want these men to suffer. She wanted them to learn. She wanted knowledge to be judged by its results. That was all. She folded the map along her father's crease lines, tucked it back into the map case, and spent the next hour reviewing tomorrow's phase structure. Phase 2, target discrimination in a mock settlement environment. Threat identification, friendly identification, no-shoot identification. Speed and judgment weighted equally. Penalties for incorrect engagements doubled. She knew what she would do. She would be slower than the veterans. She accepted that too. Speed came with repetition, and repetition came with time, and she had 17 years to their collective centuries. She was not competing on speed. She was competing on accuracy, on judgment, on the one thing that could not be faked and could not be dismissed regardless of the age of the person deploying it. She was competing on the willingness to wait. Outside her window, the desert had gone completely silent. No wind, no traffic, just the faint hum of the facility's generator and the occasional distant coyote making its thoughts known to the darkness. Maddie turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a moment. "I'm here, Dad," she said quietly. She did not say anything else. She didn't need to. She lay down, set her alarm for 4:15, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, phase 2 would begin. And the men who had laughed at her would start to understand that the thing they had mistaken for youth and inexperience was something else entirely, something that had been trained and tested and refined across years of quiet, disciplined, unwitnessed work by a girl who had learned from the best teacher she had ever known that results were the only language that could not be argued with. The desert was quiet. Maddie Hale slept. And somewhere in the facility, Cole Rourke sat at his own desk reviewing her Phase 1 data for the third time with an expression that no one was there to see and that he would not have chosen to display in any case. He was not convinced, not yet. But for the first time since she had walked through his range gate, he was not certain. And for a man like Cole Rourke, uncertainty was the beginning of the only thing he truly respected. The truth, 4:15 in the morning, the alarm went off and Maddie was already awake. She had been lying in the dark for 11 minutes running the day's variables through her mind, the way her father had taught her, not with anxiety, but with the calm, systematic attention of someone preparing a tool for precise work. Phase 2, settlement environment, threat discrimination, speed and judgment weighted equally. She had reviewed the structural layout from the facility briefing documents until she could walk the course in her mind without a map. She got up dressed, ate a protein bar, and drank half a liter of water standing at the small window. Outside the desert was still black. The stars over Arizona in July were something that people from cities never quite believed until they saw them dense and white and indifferent to everything happening below them. She didn't look at them long. She had work to do. The staging area at OSH 545 was cooler than the day before, though, not by enough to matter. The veterans were already assembling, most of them carrying coffee, talking in the low and easy tones of professionals who had been doing early mornings their entire adult lives. Pierce was there, stretching his neck, turning his head side to side with the slow deliberateness of a man working out tension he had probably been carrying since the previous afternoon. He noticed Maddie arrive. He did not say anything. He also did not look away as quickly as he had before. That was a change. Rourke appeared at 0600, exactly same as the day before. He had his tablet, his stopwatch, and an expression that communicated nothing except that he was present and in command of the situation. He gave the Phase 2 briefing in 11 minutes. When he finished, he asked if there were questions. Nobody asked any. Good, Rourke said. Move to the settlement. The mock settlement at Red Mesa was a permanent training structure, a collection of low buildings, narrow corridors, open courtyards, and partial walls that could be reconfigured between trials. For Phase 2, the range staff had arranged it to represent a generic desert village, environment buildings of varying height, a main street running east to west, 3 intersecting alleys and multiple windows and doorways that could conceal or expose targets. The electronic target system was what made it sophisticated. Rather than static silhouettes, this settlement used reactive targets, sensors that appeared and disappeared on command, displayed on screens, mounted in windows and doorways, each one coded to register as either hostile, neutral, or friendly. Hostile targets were armed silhouettes in aggressive postures. Neutral targets were unarmed civilian representations. Friendly targets were marker panels that identified them as allied personnel. The rules were precise and unforgiving. Engaging a hostile target scored points. Engaging a neutral target applied a 2-point penalty. Engaging a friendly target zeroed your run entirely. The scoring system logged every shot, every hesitation, every target that appeared and was not engaged within the time window. Speed of engagement was factored into the score. Hesitation cost points, but wrong engagement cost more. Pierce went first. He moved through the settlement with the physical confidence of a man who had cleared real buildings with real consequences, and that confidence showed. He was fast, he was decisive, he made 12 correct engagements in the first 2 minutes, moving with a rhythm that was genuinely impressive to watch, the kind of fluid, automatic competence that only comes from thousands of hours of repetition in high-stakes environments. Then he made his first wrong call. A target appeared in a second-story window. A silhouette with ambiguous posture, one arm raised position unclear from the angle Pierce was moving at. He engaged it immediately. The system registered neutral target, 2-point penalty. Pierce's head came down for half a second. It was the only sign he gave. He reset immediately and continued. He finished with 14 correct engagements, 1 neutral penalty, and a final score that Rourke logged without comment. The other veterans followed one by one. The results clustered in a range. Most of them scored well on speed. Several hit neutral targets in the ambiguous windows. Two of them, veterans with the most combat experience, made an error pattern that was interesting. They were so conditioned to threat-forward environments that they weighted aggression too heavily, shooting faster than the scoring model rewarded and incurring penalties on borderline targets. One veteran, a former Marine Raider named Cortez, who had joined the trial as a non-SEAL participant, completed his run without a single penalty. Rourke made a small notation on his tablet. Cortez was a deliberate man. He had not been the fastest in Phase 1 either. He finished his settlement run with a score 3 points below Pierce on raw engagement count, but clean on penalties. Maddie went last. Rourke did not orchestrate this. It was simply the order in which the participants had been assigned. But the effect of it, 14 men having already run the course before her 14 sets of data, giving everyone a baseline against which to measure whatever happened next, was not something that anyone failed to notice. She stepped into the settlement entrance with her sidearm. Phase 2 was conducted with handguns at reduced distances and waited for the start signal. One of the range officers, a young man named Garrett, who had been operating the target control system all morning, looked at his screen and then looked at Maddie with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she said. The buzzer sounded. She moved, and immediately the difference was visible. She was slower than Pierce, significantly slower. Where Pierce had moved through the first quarter in 8 seconds, Maddie took 14. She was not hesitating out of uncertainty. She was doing something else. She was reading the environment before committing to movement, scanning angles before entering them, placing her attention on 3 points simultaneously, the way her father had taught her where she was going, and what she couldn't yet see. The first target appeared in a doorway, hostile, clear, unambiguous. She engaged it cleanly and moved. The second target was a neutral. It appeared in a side window at the moment she was crossing an open section of the main street, a position of exposure, and she had already identified it as non-hostile from its posture before the sensor registered it. She kept moving. The third target was the first test. It appeared in an alleyway mouth at the exact moment that a friendly marker panel was visible 2 feet to its right. The target itself was posed aggressively, weapon visible, forward lean. But the shadow it cast told Maddie something the front-facing sensor couldn't communicate. The arm was coming down, not raising. The figure was in the act of lowering a weapon, not raising one. She waited 2 seconds, the longest 2 seconds of the morning. Every man watching had stopped breathing in the same moment, because 2 seconds in a building clearance is an eternity. 2 seconds is the window in which decisions get made that cannot be unmade. The target's arm completed its downward arc. The posture shifted from aggressive to compliant. Maddie did not engage. She moved past. Friendly, the system registered as if confirming what she had already concluded before the sensor caught up. Pierce, who was watching on the monitor with Rourke, said something under his breath. Nobody asked him to repeat it. Everyone had heard it anyway. She read the shadow, he said. The course continued. By the halfway point, Maddie had made 7 correct engagements and 0 penalties. She was running at roughly 70% of Pierce's speed, which meant her raw engagement count was lower. But she had not touched a neutral target. She had not touched a friendly. Every round she had fired had landed in the correct category. Then the course threw its hardest scenario. 3 targets appeared simultaneously in 3 different locations: a hostile in the far window, a neutral in the near doorway, and a friendly in the alley to the right. 3 targets, 3 different classifications, all visible at the same time. The scenario was designed to overload to force either hesitation or error, because processing 3 simultaneous inputs and responding correctly required the kind of neural bandwidth that typically only came with years of specifically relevant training. Most of the veterans had seen 2 of the 3 correctly and made a penalty on the third. Pierce had seen all 3 correctly, but had taken 4 seconds to process them, long enough that the hostile target scored as a partial because of the time lapse. Maddie stopped. Not froze. Stopped. There was a difference, and everyone watching on the monitor could see it. She stopped moving, planted her feet, turned her head through a smooth 45-degree arc that took in all 3 targets in a single visual sweep, and then engaged them in a sequence so fast that the monitor showed the 3 shots separated by less than a second and a half. Hostile. Move. Neutral, ignore. Move. Friendly, ignore. Clear. 0 penalties. 3 correct classifications in 1.4 seconds. Garrett at the control station looked at the monitor and then looked at Rourke. Rourke did not look at Garrett. He was looking at the monitor. His jaw had moved, not to speak, just a small, involuntary tightening. The kind of thing that happens when a man receives information that he is not yet ready to verbally process. Maddie completed the course. She stepped out of the settlement exit and ejected her magazine with the habitual automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing this since she was a child, and she looked at the range clock. Her time was behind Pierce's. She had known it would be. She walked to where the water station was and drank and waited. Rourke called the debrief at the center courtyard. The men gathered. Maddie stood at the left edge of the group, same as the morning before. Rourke read the scores. When he got to Maddie's, he read the engagement count first, which was lower than most of the men, and then read the penalties, 0. He read it without inflection. He might have been reading a weather report. The silence that followed was a specific kind. The kind that forms when a group of people receive information that requires them to individually recalculate something they thought they had already calculated. Pierce put his water bottle down on a low wall and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Cortez, the former Marine raider, who had also run clean, turned his head toward Maddie with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Webb crossed his arms and looked at the ground. And then Pierce said out loud to no one specifically, "She read the shadow on target 3. Nobody responded immediately. The posture was dropping, Maddie said. She wasn't correcting him. She was answering what he'd actually been asking, which was not a statement, but a question about method. The shadow angle showed the arm arc before the target sensor updated. Pierce turned toward her fully. This was the first time he had turned toward her fully in 2 days. Not a sidelong glance, not a peripheral assessment. Good, Brett. You were watching the shadow of a target while moving through an open corridor under a 3-target scenario, he said. I was watching everything, Maddie said. That's the job. She said it without challenge. It was the same thing she had told Webb the evening before. She meant it both times the same way, as a simple statement of professional standard, not as a rebuke. Pierce looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Rourke. Rourke was making a notation on his tablet and did not return the look. That night, the dynamics inside the dormitory had quietly shifted in the way that dynamics shift when they are driven by genuine information rather than social performance. Nobody announced anything. Nobody made a speech. But Pierce found himself sitting across from Maddie at the mess table for the first time, not by accident, and the conversation they had was not about the trial. It was about her father. Not because Pierce asked about him, he didn't, not directly, but Maddie had left her father's map on the table while she ate. And Pierce, who was the kind of man who noticed things even when he was pretending not to, looked at it and said, "That's not your handwriting." "No," Maddie said. "Whose is it?" A pause. "My father's." Pierce looked at the map. He could see the notations, small, careful, precise. Observation points. Wind patterns. Range-specific corrections made during what looked like actual visits to the ranges marked. "He was here," Pierce said. It wasn't a question. He could see Red Mesa labeled in the margin. 7 years ago, Maddie said, he came to present a methodology to the program. They passed on it. Pierce looked up from the map. Something in his expression had changed. What kind of methodology? Maddie told him. Not the full version that would have taken hours, but the outline. Environmental integration. Reading multiple data streams simultaneously. The shadow reading he had identified in the settlement. The dust plume she had used in Phase 1. All of it connected, all of it part of a system her father had spent more than a decade developing and never once received formal credit for. Pierce listened. I was a man who had talked over people his entire life, not maliciously, simply because he had always been the fastest and the loudest and the most confident, and those qualities had always been rewarded, and what gets rewarded gets repeated. But he listened to Maddie without interrupting for 7 minutes, which was by his own internal accounting some kind of record. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Why didn't he fight harder for it? Pierce said. The methodology. Why didn't he push back when they turned it down? Maddie looked at him. Because, she said carefully, when someone tells you that your knowledge isn't valuable because of where it came from, you have 2 choices. You can spend your energy arguing about your credentials, or you can spend it making the knowledge better. He chose to make it better. Pierce absorbed this. And you, he said, What are you spending your energy on? Maddie looked down at the map, at her father's handwriting, at the careful, patient notations of a man who had done the work in obscurity and never complained about it. Proving it works, she said. Pierce didn't answer, but the way he folded his hands on the table and looked at the map for another long moment, the quality of his attention told Maddie more than her response would have. The next morning, day 3, Rourke changed the rules. He announced it at 0600 with the same flat calm he brought to everything, but the content of the announcement sent a visible current through the assembled group. The final phase, originally scheduled to include 20 reactive targets under simulated adverse conditions, had been revised. 30 targets, 10 additional. The time window would be the same. Maddie heard this and felt something cold move through her. Not fear. She had studied fear carefully enough to recognize when something was fear and when it was something else. This was assessment, cold, immediate, very fast assessment of what 30 targets meant relative to 20, not just in terms of volume, but in terms of concentration, positioning, and the decision-making load that each additional target placed on a shooter who was already managing multiple environmental variables in adverse conditions. 20 targets at distance under simulated sandstorm conditions was hard. 30 targets was a different category. One of the veterans, a quiet, methodical man named Harker, who had not said anything notable in 2 days, raised his hand. "What's the reasoning for the change?" he said. Rourke looked at him. "Conditions evolution. The final phase should reflect maximum operational stress." "We prepped for 20, Harker said. "Not challenging, factual." "Correct," Rourke said. "Now you'll perform with 30. Questions?" Nobody asked any more questions. But as the group dispersed toward the staging area, Pierce walked beside Maddie for the first time without any of the physical distance that implied separation, and he spoke quietly. "He's testing whether conditions can rattle you," Pierce said. "More targets, same time, last-minute change." "I know," Maddie said. "You're okay with that?" She looked at him. "Are you?" Pierce almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "Not entirely," he said honestly, which was the most honest thing he had said in 2 days, and they both knew it. The staging for Phase 3 took 2 hours. Equipment was checked and rechecked. The Barrett rifles were reissued. Ammunition counts were logged. The range staff mounted enormous industrial fans at the eastern perimeter, the sandstorm simulation which Maddie had read about in the facility briefing documents, in which, even having read about it, did not fully prepare her for the reality of standing in front of it. When the fans came on, the desert rearranged itself. Dust that had been sitting on the floor of the range since the last time it rained, which in this part of Arizona could mean months ago, rose in a wall that was not a storm and not a fog, but something in between. Visibility collapsed 50 yards in the direction of the fans and recovered unevenly past that, meaning that at the distances where the targets would appear, you were looking through a shifting, breathable curtain of particulate matter that moved at uneven speeds and densities, and that your scope could partially compensate for but not eliminate. The veterans went first. Rourke organized the runs in the same order as previous phases, which meant Maddie would shoot last again. She stood with the non-active competitors in the observation position, a covered platform with clear sight lines to the scoring monitors, and watched. The veteran who ran first, a compact, efficient man named Diaz, who had said very little throughout the trial, but whose Phase 1 score had been the second highest managed 11 head zone hits before the conditions peaked and his rhythm broke. He finished with 13 total, 2 of them body zone hits that scored at reduced value and 0 penalties. It was a strong run. The others followed. Some ran better than Diaz. Several ran worse. The dust and the noise from the fans, a constant pervasive pressure of industrial sound that made communication difficult and added a layer of sensory overload to an already demanding task, affected different shooters differently. The men with the most combat experience were paradoxically not always the best performers in this environment. Their instincts were calibrated for a different kind of chaos, one that included human variables. Their bodies knew how to respond to mechanical chaos, impersonal, abstract, generated by fans rather than circumstance, didn't fire the same neurological responses. Pierce ran fourth. He was objectively excellent. He identified the wind layers faster than any competitor before him, not because he was using the environmental integration method, but because he had the raw athleticism and trained attentiveness to read conditions quickly from his own experience. He made corrections, and most of his corrections were right. He reached 20 targets before the conditions peaked. He finished with 17 head zone hits. The observation platform erupted, because 17 was the best score in Phase 3 anyone could remember seeing. The range officials were consulting monitors, confirming sensor readings, double-checking the footage. 17 clean head zone hits in those conditions with those targets at those distances. Pierce stepped back from the firing line, and someone handed him water, and the men around him were saying things, real things, not performative things. The words people use when they've actually watched something extraordinary happen. Rourke logged the score without expression. But Maddie, watching from the platform, had noticed something. Pierce had identified two wind layers, surface and flight path. He had read the mirage correctly and the dust correctly and used them to build a solution that was accurate for most of the course. But there was a third layer. She had seen it when the fans changed speed, a subtle shift, the kind that only revealed itself as an inconsistency in target movement at the farthest distances. The targets at 14 and 1,500 yards were not moving in precise agreement with what the two-layer solution predicted. They were drifting by approximately 3 inches more to the left. A torn range flag near the far rocky ridge was showing something. A third wind current, compressed through the canyon, coming from the northeast at flight path altitude, intersecting the others at approximately 900 yards downrange. Pierce had missed it. With his 17 hits, it hadn't cost him much. The longest targets at that third layer distance had been edge hits scored, but not head zone. With a 3-inch correction, they would have been perfect. Maddie turned this over in her mind, and then she stopped thinking about Pierce's run and began thinking about her own. 21 scored targets, same conditions, one shooter who had already demonstrated she could read 3 wind layers simultaneously. The math was not comfortable, because 21 head zone hits in those conditions was not something that should be possible. Even knowing the methodology, even with environmental integration working exactly as designed, even with every variable in her favor, it was not something that should be possible. And yet, Rourke appeared at the base of the observation platform. "Hale," he said. She came down. He walked with her to the staging point without speaking. When they arrived, he handed her the Barrett's ammunition complement, a specific count logged to her name, and then stood with his arms at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not contempt, not assessment, something closer to a question. "You've been watching their runs," he said. "Yes." "What did you see?" It was not a casual question. He was not making conversation. Rourke never made conversation. He was asking her a real question, and both of them knew that her answer would tell him something he wanted to know. Maddie looked out at the range. The fans were still running. The dust was moving in its uneven shifting pattern, and at the far end, the torn flag near the ridge was doing what it had been doing for the last 2 hours, oscillating in a way that didn't quite align with the surface reading. 3 wind layers, she said. Everyone was solving for 2. A pause. "You're sure about the third?" "The flag near the North Canyon. The targets at 1,400 and beyond are drifting left by approximately 3 inches more than a 2-layer solution accounts for." Rourke was quiet. "That flag has been there since yesterday," he said. "Nobody else mentioned it." "I know," Maddie said. Another pause. Longer. "Pierce scored 17, Rourke said. "I know. That's the highest Phase 3 score in 3 trial iterations." "I know," she said for the third time. He looked at her for a moment. "The conditions are going to peak during your run," he said. "Visibility will be lowest. Fan speed is increasing. I can offer you a modified target count given the deteriorating conditions." Maddie looked at him. "Is that what you offered, Pierce?" Rourke said nothing. "Then I'll take the same course they did," Maddie said. She turned toward the firing position and settled behind the Barrett. The range officer gave her the ready signal. The fans were running at maximum now. The dust was a living thing moving in sheets and columns that opened and closed across the range, like curtains being drawn and released by invisible hands. The noise was a constant grinding pressure. The heat inside the dust was 10 degrees worse than the open air around it. Maddie placed her eye to the scope. She didn't see targets. She didn't see distances. She saw the range as a system the same way she had learned to see it at 9 years old, lying on her stomach in a field behind her father's house, with a .22 and a set of targets her father had set up at varying distances, and her father's voice in her ear, saying, "Don't look at the target, look at everything between you and the target. The air is full of information. Learn to read it." She read it now. Surface wind, 8 miles per hour west-southwest. Visible in the dust behavior at the firing line. Mid-range current 11 miles per hour varying northwest. Visible in the mirage behavior above the rocky terrain between 5 and 900 yards. Third layer, the canyon compression. Northeast approximately 6 to 9 miles per hour entering the bullet path between 900 and 1,500 yards. Visible in the flag and in the subtle drift inconsistency she had been tracking in the far targets for the past 90 minutes. She applied all three. She took 3 slow breaths. She fired. The first target dropped. Head zone. She cycled acquired adjusted for the next distance, applied a half correction to account for a density shift she had seen in the dust 2 seconds before fired. Head zone. The observation platform, which had been loud with conversation throughout the veterans' runs, had gone quiet sometime in the first 20 seconds of Maddie's run, in the way that large groups of people go quiet when they become collectively aware that they are witnessing something that does not fit the category they had prepared for it. Pierce stood at the front of the platform with his arms crossed and his score, his extraordinary career. Best score behind him, and he watched the monitor and he counted. 10, 14, 17. She passed his score at target 17 and there was a sound from somewhere on the platform that was not a word, just a sound, the involuntary output of a group of men confronting something their nervous systems hadn't processed yet. 18, 19. The 20th target dropped and Maddie had 1 round remaining and the 21st target had not yet appeared, and Rourke, who was standing 6 feet behind her, said quietly but clearly, "Don't force the shot." She heard him. She breathed. The 21st target rose from behind a friendly marker panel at 1,500 yards. It was partially concealed. There was a narrow window 3 to 4 inches exposed by the target's movement pattern, cycling in a slow drift that she had been predicting for the past 40 seconds based on the targeting algorithm she had identified from watching previous exposures. She had 3 seconds. The dust shifted. The visibility window opened fractionally. She waited. 1 second. The target drifted. 2 seconds. The window appeared. She fired. The range monitor took 2 full seconds to register. 2 seconds in which nobody on the observation platform moved or spoke or apparently breathed. Then the screen updated. 21 head zone hits. 0 penalties. And the silence on that platform was the loudest thing Maddie Hale had ever heard in her life. Pierce took off his sunglasses. He looked at the monitor. He looked at it for the long time, the way you look at something when your brain is processing an instruction that your eyes sent it, but that doesn't match any existing category in your experience. Then he looked at Rourke. Rourke was looking at his tablet, then at the range sensor panel, then at the target footage monitor. He was checking. He was doing what a rigorous man does when he receives a result that exceeds his parameters. He looks for the error. His face told the story of not finding one. Pierce put his sunglasses back on. He turned away from the monitor and walked to the edge of the platform and looked out at the range where the dust was still moving and the flag near the canyon was still oscillating in its 3-layer truth. And he stood there with the measured private stillness of a man making a genuine internal adjustment. Somewhere behind him, Webb said something quietly to Harker that Maddie, standing below the platform at the firing line, could not hear. She didn't need to. She was looking at her father's map, which she had folded into her shirt pocket that morning. She put her hand on it once briefly. The way you touch something that means more than you can say out loud. Then she set the Barrett down on its bipod, and she walked off the firing line with her head up, and the desert received her in silence, as if it too was still deciding what it had just witnessed. The dust was still moving when Rourke walked to the range control station. I didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He walked with the same measured pace he brought to everything, but his jaw was set in a way that the men who knew him well recognized immediately the jaw of a man who has received information that he is not prepared to accept at face value and who intends to examine it until either it breaks or he does. Garrett, the range officer at the control station, saw him coming and pulled up the scoring dashboard without being asked. Rourke stood in front of the monitor and looked at it for a full 30 seconds without speaking. 21 head zone hits, 0 penalties, time window within parameters. He pulled up the sensor logs. Every target had registered a confirmed strike event, every strike location mapped to the head zone coordinate grid. The system had not flagged any anomalies. The ammunition count from Maddie's complement matched the number of registered shots, exactly 21 rounds issued, 21 rounds fired, 21 confirmed head zone strikes. Rourke scrolled through the footage from the range cameras, 4 angles. He went through them one by one, pausing on the final shot, the 21st at 1,500 yards through the narrow window behind the friendly marker panel. Well, he watched it 3 times. The first time he watched the bullet's point of impact on the target sensor. Head zone confirmed. The second time he watched the friendly marker panel's position relative to the target at the moment of firing. Clear window, 3 to 4 inches of exposure. The shot had passed through it cleanly. The third time he watched Maddie. He watched the stillness of her body in the moment before the shot. The controlled breath, the absence of any visible tension in her shoulders or her trigger hand. The way she waited, not the waiting of someone who was uncertain, but the waiting of someone who was certain and was simply allowing the external conditions to catch up with the internal decisions she had already made. He had seen that quality of waiting before. Once, in 22 years of SEAL operations and 12 more years of training, the best precision shooters available to the civilian military pipeline. Once, he closed the footage. He turned toward Garrett. "Run a full sensor diagnostic on the Phase 3 array," he said. Garrett looked at him. "Sir, the system's already flagged clean. All sensors registered within..." "Run it again," Rourke said. A pause. "Yes, sir," Garrett said. Rourke walked back to the staging area. The group had dispersed from the observation platform and gathered loosely in the shade structure near the equipment depot. Most of them had water. Several were talking. The quality of conversation had changed from the morning. There was a different pitch to it, something tighter and more private, the sound of people processing something collectively without anyone having agreed to process it collectively. Pierce was standing at the far end of the shade structure, slightly apart from the others. He had his arms crossed, and he was looking at the ground in the way of a man who is not looking at the ground, but looking at something inside himself that the ground is providing a convenient excuse to focus on. When he heard Rourke approaching, he looked up. "She clean," Pierce said. The directness of it, no preamble, no contextualizing, was Pierce at his most honest, which was the version of Pierce that very few people outside combat operations had ever seen. Rourke looked at him. "The system flagged clean," Rourke said. "I'm running a second diagnostic." Pierce nodded once, not a skeptical nod, a confirming one. "You're not going to find an error," Pierce said. Rourke said nothing. "Cole Rourke," Pierce said, which was the name he used when he meant what he was about to say. "I was watching her run from the platform. I saw every shot. I was counting." Rourke waited. "She wasn't shooting targets," Pierce said. "She was shooting a system. Every correction she made, she wasn't reacting to each target individually. She was predicting where the whole course was going based on environmental variables she had been tracking since we arrived. That third wind layer she mentioned this morning, the canyon compression thing, she built a firing solution around it 3 hours before she pulled the trigger." A pause. "I watched us miss it," Pierce said. "All of us, including me." Rourke was quiet for a long time. "She's 17 years old," he said. It came out less like a dismissal and more like a man saying a thing aloud in order to hear how it sounds and determine whether it still means what he thought it meant. Pierce looked at him evenly. "Yeah," Pierce said. "She is." Rourke turned and walked back to the control station without another word. Meanwhile, Maddie sat on the low concrete wall at the edge of the staging area, the same wall she had used during every water break across 3 days, and drank from her bottle and let her body do what bodies do after extreme, sustained effort. Her hands were entirely steady. Her breathing had returned to normal. Her heart rate, which she monitored through the simple practice of placing 2 fingers against her wrist and counting, was 62 beats per minute. She felt calm, not triumphant, not relieved. Calm in the same specific way she felt calm after every successful run. The quiet that came when the outcome finally matched the preparation in the long arc of effort resolved into a single confirmed result. She was aware of people looking at her. She was used to being looked at in competition environments. The quality of the looking was different now. 2 days ago, it had been the sideways glance of people deciding what category she belonged in. Now it was something more direct, more uncertain. The looking of people who have placed someone in a category and are standing in front of the evidence that the category was wrong. Cortez came and sat beside her. I was a quiet man. The former Marine rated her with careful eyes in the economy of movement that came from a long time spent in environments where unnecessary motion attracted unwanted attention. He had run clean in Phase 2 and had been the best non-SEAL performer in Phase 1. He had not mocked her on the first day. He had also not intervened when others did, which was a different kind of choice, but Maddie didn't hold it against him. Silence in a room full of loud men was its own form of caution. Your father developed the methodology, Cortez said. He said it directly, which meant Pierce had talked. Yes, Maddie said. Environmental integration, Cortez said. I've heard that term, not from your father specifically, but I've heard versions of it discussed in some specialized training context. Maddie looked at him. This was new information. Where, she said. Marsoc had a consultant about 8 years ago who was working on similar principles. I don't know the man's name. I was a junior operator at the time. But the framework he was describing, reading multiple environmental data streams, simultaneously integrating them into a single firing solution. The language was different, but the idea was the same. He paused. The program didn't implement it formally, Cortez said. Budget cycle, personnel changes. The usual reasons things don't happen. Maddie was quiet for a moment. Did it work, she said. What you saw demonstrated. Cortez looked at the range. From what I could tell at the time, he said, it worked better than what we were using. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The implication completed itself that the knowledge had existed, had been demonstrated to work, and had been set aside for reasons that had nothing to do with its effectiveness, and that this was not an unusual outcome. Maddie thought about her father, about the drive home from this facility 7 years ago, about the dinner he had cooked without talking much, and the way he had resumed his work the next morning, without self-pity or bitterness, adding notes to his maps and refining his methodology as if the rejection had simply been another data point. She thought about all the things that could have been different if someone had listened earlier. She thought about them once and then she put them away. This was a thing her father had taught her too. You could grieve what didn't happen. You could acknowledge it, give it its proper weight, and then you had to put it in its place and keep moving forward. Grief that became resonance with grief that became obstruction. She had work to do. The diagnostic Rourke ordered on the Phase 3 sensor array came back clean at 1400 hours. Every sensor within specification, every target reading verified, every strike location confirmed. Garrett delivered the results to Rourke with the careful, even tone of a man presenting information that he knows will be difficult to receive, and who has decided that the most professional thing he can do is present it accurately and not apologize for its content. Rourke read the report. He read it twice. He set it on the desk. He was still sitting there when the door to the control station opened and General Nathaniel Brooks walked in. Brooks was 67 years old and had been retired from the Marine Corps for 4 years, which had not materially changed anything about how he occupied a room. He was a large man, not physically imposing in the way that Pierce was physically imposing, but imposing in the way that certain kinds of authority become physically manifest in the body, in the carriage, in the pace, in the way space rearranged itself around him without him appearing to ask it to. I was carrying a sealed file case. Rourke looked up. He had known Brooks for 16 years. They had not always agreed. They had always respected each other, which was a more durable arrangement. You ran the diagnostic twice, Brooks said. How did you know? Because I know you. Brooks set the file case on the desk and sat down across from Rourke. And because when you receive a result that challenges your model, the first thing you do is look for a system failure. The second thing you do is look harder. Rourke said nothing. Did you find one? Brooks said. No, Rourke said. Brooks nodded. He opened the file case and removed a document, a formal competition record bearing the seal of the International Precision Shooting Association, with supplementary documentation from a civilian range authority in New Mexico. He placed it in front of Rourke. At 16, Brooks said, under supervised international civilian competition conditions, Maddie Hale achieved a verified long-range accuracy record in her weight class and age division that has not been matched by any competitor since. At 16 and 2 months, she completed 3 consecutive perfect advanced courses, the maximum difficulty available to civilian competitors without a single scored penalty across any of the 3 runs. Rourke looked at the documents. She wasn't invited here because she needed your approval, Brooks said. She was invited because this program needed to learn from her. The silence that followed was the kind that forms in enclosed spaces when something important has been said, and both people in the room are aware that what comes next will be shaped by how the next 30 seconds are navigated. Rourke looked at the documents, then he looked at Brooks. "Why didn't you tell me this when you submitted her invitation?" Rourke said. Because you would have managed her," Brooks said simply. "You would have built a structure around her performance that protected the program's dignity instead of letting the program be challenged. I needed the trial to run without a safety net." Rourke absorbed this. I was a man who did not appreciate being managed. He was also a man who, when presented with accurate reasoning, could acknowledge it regardless of how much he disliked the method. "That's a significant professional judgment to make unilaterally," Rourke said. "Yes," Brooks said, "it was." He did not apologize. Rourke picked up the competition record and looked at it again. At 16, 3 consecutive perfect advanced courses. He thought about what that required, not just technically, but psychologically. The sustained concentration, the management of external pressure, the refusal to let performance expectations collapse under scrutiny. At 16 years old, he set the document down. "The controversy is going to be significant," he said. "Some of the officers on the review board are going to argue that comparing a civilian teenager to active duty SEALs was structurally unfair to both parties. Some of them will," Brooks agreed. "Some of them will say it was a publicity event. Some of them will question the integrity of the scoring. They will do what people do when reality doesn't match their model. They will question the measurement instead of adjusting the model." "And what do you intend to do about that?" Rourke said. Brooks looked at him levelly. "I intend to let the sensor data speak," he said. "And I intend to let you speak. Because you were there, Cole. You watched every shot. And whatever you may have expected, when she walked through that gate, you know what you saw." Rourke said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood up from the desk and walked to the window of the control station, and he looked out at the range where the dust from Phase 3 was still settling, and the industrial fans had been powered down, and the silence of the desert had returned to its natural register. He could see Maddie from here. She was still sitting on the concrete wall at the edge of the staging area. She had her father's map open on her knee, and she was making a notation with a pencil, adding something to the margins the way her father had added things carefully, precisely with the handwriting of someone who expected the notes to be useful in the future. Rourke watched her for a moment. "She asked me if she was getting the same course offer I'd given Pierce," he said, "when I gave her the option to run a modified target count." Brooks waited. "I hadn't given Pierce that option," Rourke said. A pause. "She knew that," Rourke said. "Yes," Brooks said. "She did." Rourke turned from the window. "Call the all group debrief for 1600 hours, he said. "I want everyone present, range officials, visiting advisors, all competitors." Brooks stood. "That's the right call." "Don't congratulate me for making it," Rourke said. "I should have made it faster." He picked up his tablet from the desk and walked out of the control station. Out on the staging area, the word had begun to move through the group the way words move in closed professional environments. Not announced, not formally communicated, but migrating from person to person through the combination of expression and implication that functions as the unofficial information network of any tight-knit group. Webb heard it first from Garrett, who mentioned the full group debrief while collecting equipment. Webb's response was to stand very still for approximately 4 seconds and then look across the staging area at Pierce with an expression that communicated without words, "This is happening." Pierce looked back with an expression that communicated, "I know." Several of the range officials had begun a secondary review of the footage, not because they had been instructed to, but because the human impulse to verify the astonishing is very difficult to suppress, and these were professionals whose training was specifically oriented toward verification. They watched the 21st shot at 1,500 yards from 2 camera angles. They watched it again. They ran the measurement algorithm against the registered impact coordinates. Head zone, center mass of the head zone, not an edge hit, not a marginal registration, center. Harker, who had been watching over the shoulder of one of the range officials, quietly said, 3 wind layers, she solved for 3. The range official looked up. "How do you know it was 3, the official said. "Because I went back and looked at the flag data from the canyon ridge," Harker said. "The 3rd layer was there the whole time. We were all compensating for 2. He paused. "Her corrections match a 3-layer solution." Exactly. The official looked at the footage again. That means she identified the third layer before the run, the official said. Before the run, Harker confirmed. Probably before we started phase 3 entirely. The official was quiet for a moment. She was watching the flag while she was watching our runs, the official said slowly. She was watching everything, Harker said. And something in the way he said it, the flat confirming certainty of it, made the official turn back to the monitor and look at Maddie's run from the beginning, from the very first shot, with a different understanding of what he was actually watching. At 15:45, Pierce crossed the staging area and walked toward where Maddie was sitting. She saw him coming. She folded the map not hurriedly, just naturally, and looked at him as he approached. Pierce was a big man, and he covered ground quickly, but he slowed as he got closer. The way people slow when they are approaching something that requires a different quality of attention than the one they arrived with. He stopped a few feet from her. Han had his sunglasses pushed up on his forehead now. Without them, his face was more readable, and what it read was something between admiration and a kind of personal reckoning that he had not fully resolved yet. The third layer, he said, the canyon compression. You identified it yesterday morning, didn't you? Before phase 2 even started. During the approach to phase 1, Maddie said, the canyon is visible from the ridgeline on the north route. The flag behavior near the mouth was already showing inconsistency with the surface reading. Pierce stared at her. You were carrying 40 pounds in 109 degrees on a 5% grade, he said. Information doesn't stop being available because you're tired, Maddie said. That's exactly when you need it most. Pierce was quiet. Then he said something that cost him something to say, which was the only reason it was worth saying. I owe you an apology, he said. The permission slip comment. The first day, that was an assessment. That was reflex, and it was wrong. Maddie looked at him. She let the words land without filling the space around them. It was the reflex of someone who'd never been surprised before, she said. Not as absolution, as a fact. That's not the same as being a bad person. It's just a gap. Pierce looked at her steadily. You're not what I thought you were, he said. I know, she said. I should have known sooner. You knew when you needed to, Maddie said. That's what matters. Pierce stood there for another moment, and then he sat down on the wall beside her, not close a respectful distance, but beside her. And they sat together in the late afternoon heat without talking for a moment, which was the most natural and unperformed thing that had happened between any two people in this facility across 3 days. Then Pierce said, Can I ask you something? Go ahead. If you'd had the option to run a clean modified course, fewer targets, better conditions, would you have taken it? Maddie considered this. No, she said. Why not? Because the point wasn't to score well under favorable conditions, she said. The point was to demonstrate that the methodology works under the worst conditions available. If I run a clean course in good weather, I prove that I can shoot. If I run your course in your storm, she paused, I prove that what my father built is real. Pierce absorbed this. This was always about him, he said, not a question. It was always about what he knew, Maddie said carefully. He's gone. What he knew isn't. She stopped, started again. Knowledge that works shouldn't disappear because the person who built it did. It should go forward. That's what he would have wanted. Pierce was quiet for a long time. And in that quiet, for the first time since she had arrived at Red Mesa 3 days ago, Maddie felt something loosen in her chest. Not grief she had managed, grief she knew what it felt like. She had a working relationship with it by now. This was something else. The particular release of a thing held in tension for a long time, finally finding its resolution. Her father's work was real. She had proven it in front of everyone who needed to see it. He would never know. And somehow she felt that he already did. The full group debrief at 1600 hours convened in the main briefing room. The same room where Rourke had pointed toward the observation deck on the first morning. 14 competitors, 6 range officials, 2 visiting defense advisors. General Brooks and Maddie sat in the same arrangement of metal folding tables. Rourke stood at the front. He began by presenting the Phase 3 sensor diagnostic results. Full diagnostic, second confirmation, all sensors within specification, all results verified. He said this without preface and without the careful verbal architecture that people sometimes use to soften unwelcome conclusions. He said it as a statement of confirmed fact. Then he read the scores. The top Phase 3 scores: Pierce 17 confirmed head zone hits, Cortez 12, Diaz 13, four others between 8 and 11. Maddie Hale 21 confirmed head zone hits, 0 penalties. He read it once, he did not read it again. He let it exist in the room without any additional scaffolding. One of the visiting defense advisors, a man named Colonel Whitfield, who had said almost nothing across 3 days and who had the compressed, efficient quality of someone who had learned to observe everything and commit nothing prematurely, leaned forward slightly. The trial parameters for the civilian participant were identical to the military participants, Whitfield said. Yes, Rourke said. She requested the same course parameters as her peers. I confirmed it. A pause. Wind conditions during her run were consistent with conditions during the military runs. Rourke looked at the range data summary. Wind speed was actually highest during her run, he said. Peak gusts reached 17 miles per hour at surface level. Another pause. Whitfield sat back. General Brooks, the other visiting advisor, said a woman named Dr. Claire Reeves, who was a performance scientist from a defense-affiliated university. You indicated that the invitation for this participant was specifically issued to benefit the program. Can you clarify what you meant? Brooks stood. Maddie Hale developed and deployed a long-range precision methodology called environmental integration, he said. The methodology was originally developed by her father, Daniel Hale, a civilian competitive marksman who presented a version of it to this program 7 years ago and was declined because he lacked institutional credentials. Today, you watch that methodology perform in the worst Phase 3 conditions. This program has run in 3 trial iterations and produced a score that exceeds any previously recorded Phase 3 result in program history. The room was entirely quiet. I invited Miss Hale, Brooks continued, not because I believed she could replace any member of this team and not to embarrass the program or its participants. I invited her because knowledge doesn't become less true because of who holds it, and because the only way to make that case in an environment like this one is to demonstrate it. He sat down. Rourke, who had been standing at the front during all of this with his hands at his sides, looked at the room. The results will be submitted for full board review, he said. Miss Hale's score stands as recorded. And then he looked at her directly for the first time without any of the weight of doubt or dismissal. And he said, you should know that the score is not in question. It has not been in question since the second diagnostic confirmed it. A pause. I ran the second diagnostic because I was not prepared to accept a result that exceeded my expectations, Rourke said. That is not a quality that belongs on a range that calls itself an elite training program. He said this to the room, but he was talking to himself. Everyone knew it. Maddie looked at him. She did not say anything yet. She was waiting because she had gotten very good at waiting and because she understood that what Rourke was working through had not finished working itself through. She was right. He reached into the pocket of his range jacket and removed something. A small, heavy coin medal, roughly the size of a silver dollar, bearing the Red Mesa program seal on one face and the phrase accuracy under pressure on the other. A range coin, the kind issued to instructors who had, in the program's formal language, fundamentally improved the program's approach to precision training. He walked across the room and stopped in front of Maddie. He held out the coin. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it. Nobody laughed. The room was entirely quiet, and it was the kind of quiet that a room becomes when something has finished shifting, when the weight has moved, when the balance has changed, when what was assumed and what is true have finally, after considerable resistance, resolved into the same thing. Rourke nodded once. Then he looked at the entire assembled group. Debrief continues tomorrow at 0700, he said. Individual score reviews and methodology sessions. Miss Hale will be available for a question session regarding her environmental assessment process. He paused. Attendance is not optional. He picked up his tablet and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. Your father was right, he said. He said it to the room. He meant it for Maddie. Then he walked out into the desert evening, and the door closed behind him, and Maddie sat in the folding metal chair with the range coin in her hand, and her father's map folded in her shirt pocket, and the desert going purple outside the windows. Pierce was looking at her from across the room. She looked back at him. He gave her a nod, the same small controlled nod that Webb had given her on the first evening, the kind that men give when they've received information they need to carry forward. Maddie closed her hand around the coin. She thought about her father, about the drive home from this facility 7 years ago, about the dinner he had cooked in quiet, about the maps he had kept working on, adding notations in his careful handwriting, building something better in the faith that better things deserved to exist even when nobody was watching. The coin was heavy in her palm. She kept her hand closed around it for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket beside the map and sat in the settling quiet of a room that had finally decided to tell the truth. The coin was still in her pocket when the controversy started. It took less than 18 hours. By the following morning, before the 0700 debrief had even convened, the message traffic had already begun. Rourke found out about it the way he found out about most things, not through official channels, but through the quiet lateral movement of information that flows through professional networks, the way water finds low ground. A colonel on the program review board had sent a communication to 2 other board members. The communication used the phrase optics problem 3 times and the phrase structural inequity once, and did not once mention the actual scores. Rourke read the forwarded summary standing at his desk at 0515 before the facility had fully woken up with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because he had been reading for 40 minutes without remembering to drink it. He set the summary down. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. It was a man who had spent 3 decades operating in environments where disagreement was managed through hierarchy and protocol. And he understood that what was coming was not a disagreement about facts. The facts were not in dispute. The sensor data, the footage, the diagnostic, the ammunition count, all of it confirmed. What was coming was a disagreement about meaning, about what the facts were allowed to imply, about whether a result that didn't fit the expected narrative was permitted to simply exist on its own terms. He had been in those disagreements before. He had won some of them. He had lost some of them. The difference in his experience was almost never about the quality of the argument. It was about the willingness of the people involved to let evidence change them. He picked up his tablet and started writing his formal response to the board communication before 0600. He would have it finished before the debrief started. It would be factual, sourced, and entirely without defensiveness, because defensiveness, in his experience, was what people reached for when they weren't confident in their position, and he was confident in his position. Maddie Hale's score stood, and the program's integrity depended on letting it stand. He sent the response at 0649. At 0700, the debrief room filled. The atmosphere was different from the previous evening. The settled quiet that had followed Rourke's acknowledgement in the range coin and his departure through the door had not entirely survived the night. Several of the men had clearly been awake, processing things in the particular kind of energy that comes from a group of people who have privately reached different conclusions and are now sitting in the same room together was perceptible. Pierce walked in and sat down in the front row, which was not where he usually sat. He sat in the front row deliberately and with the specific quality of intention that meant he was ready to say something and was positioning himself to say it clearly. Webb sat 2 seats down from him with his arms crossed and an expression that Maddie, reading it from her seat at the left wall, classified as defensive but not hostile. The arms crossing was protection, not aggression. Webb was managing something internal. Cortez came in, nodded at Maddie, sat in the second row. Dr. Reeves entered with a leather portfolio and found a seat near General Brooks, who was already present and who had the particular stillness of someone who has anticipated every version of the next hour and has decided how to respond to each of them. Colonel Whitfield arrived last, took a seat beside a range official, and placed both hands flat on the table in front of him in the posture of a man who intends to listen before he speaks. Rourke opened the debrief at 0712 seconds because he was 12 seconds late, and he acknowledged it with a brief, undecorated, "My fault, let's begin." He covered individual score reviews, first methodical, factual, each competitor receiving a one-on-one breakdown of their 3-phase performance relative to program benchmarks. He did this with the same flat professionalism he brought to everything, neither minimizing strong performances nor softening weak assessments. When he reached Pierce's results, he said, "Phase 3 score of 17 is the highest single-phase score recorded in 3 trial iterations prior to yesterday. That stands regardless of any other result." Pierce received this without visible reaction. When he reached Maddie's results, he read them once, complete with full sensor confirmation citations, and then looked up and said, Questions about methodology are invited. Questions about the score's validity will be addressed by the documented evidence, which is in the shared review folder, accessible to all board members. One of the range officials, not Garrett, an older man named Solace, who had been with the program since its second year, raised his hand. The question I'm hearing from the board communication isn't about the sensor data, Solace said. It's about the structural comparison, whether it's appropriate to directly compare civilian and military performance under the same parameters. Rourke looked at him. The parameters were her choice, Rourke said. She explicitly declined a modified course. I understand that, Solace said carefully. But the argument being made is that the trial was not designed for this comparison, that the military participants are evaluated by standards appropriate to their operational function, and that placing a civilian result in the same framework implies a comparison that what Pierce said, it came from the front row flat and direct, and Solace stopped. Pierce was not looking at Solace. He was looking at the table in front of him in the way of a man choosing his words before he uses them. That implies a comparison that makes the military participants look inadequate, Pierce said. Is that what the argument is? Solace said nothing. Pierce looked up. I shot 17 head zone hits in those conditions, Pierce said. That is the best number I have ever produced under comparable stress. I am proud of that number, and I will defend it as a genuine representation of my capability. He paused. And she shot 21. Those two numbers can both be true at the same time. Acknowledging one doesn't erase the other. The room was quiet. The argument being made, Pierce continued, is that her number is inconvenient, that it creates a narrative that someone decided they didn't want. And the way to handle that is to challenge the structural framework instead of accepting the result. He paused again. I've been in enough after-action reviews to know what that kind of argument is. It's not about fairness, it's about comfort. Webb uncrossed his arms. He recrossed them, then uncrossed them again and put his hands on the table. He's right, Webb said. Nobody looked more surprised by this than Webb himself. Rourke waited a beat. The score stands, he said. That is the program's position, and it is mine personally. If the board wants to conduct a supplementary review, the data is available to them and I will cooperate fully. What I will not do is retroactively restructure the trial parameters to produce a more comfortable result. He looked at Whitfield. Whitfield, who had still said very little, looked back at Rourke with the steady measuring attention he had brought to 3 days of silent observation. For the record, Whitfield said, I have no issue with the score. A pause. I have a significant interest in the methodology that produced it. He looked at Maddie. Miss Hale, he said, would you be willing to walk us through your environmental assessment from phase 3, not the shooting? The reading. Start from when you identified the third wind layer. Every head in the room turned toward her. This was the moment, not the firing line, not the final shot. This a room full of experienced, skeptical, accomplished people looking at her and genuinely asking to be taught something. Maddie stood up. She didn't walk to the front of the room immediately. She went to her bag, took out her father's map, and unfolded it on the nearest clear surface so that the Red Mesa notations were visible. Then she walked to the front. She began to speak. She started from the approach road on the first morning, the canyon geometry, the way the topography of the North Ridge created a compression channel that surface-level instruments couldn't detect because they were positioned on the flat range floor, not elevated to flight path altitude. She described the flag behavior, what it meant, what it didn't mean, why its inconsistency relative to the surface reading was the tell. She described the visual integration process, how to hold surface data, mid-range mirage data, and distant flag data simultaneously in a single awareness without weighting any one of them over the others too early. How the firing solution emerged from the integration rather than from any single source. She drew it on the whiteboard, not in military symbology, but in the simple, clear diagrams her father had used in his teaching notes. Arrows, wind layers, bullet path arcs, the deviation points where each layer affected the trajectory. The room listened, not politely, actually listened the quality of attention that a professional gives when they are receiving information that is changing something for them in real time, reorganizing their understanding of something they thought they already understood. Whitfield was making notes. Dr. Reeves had her phone out and was recording with Maddie's permission, which she had given without hesitation. Pierce was leaning forward with both elbows on the table, watching the whiteboard the way he had watched the monitor when her scores appeared. The focused, unsentimental attention of someone measuring something against their own experience and finding the measurement informative. Rourke stood against the back wall with his arms at his sides and his tablet in his right hand and said nothing throughout. But his eyes had not left the whiteboard since Maddie had started drawing. She finished after 31 minutes. She capped the marker. She looked at the room. Webb raised his hand, not sarcastically, genuinely. The shadow reading in the settlement on day 2, he said. That's from the same system, the same integration principle. Same principle, Maddie said. Different data inputs. In the settlement, you're reading movement instead of wind. But the underlying method is the same. You're not looking at the target. You're looking at everything between you and the target and letting the integrated picture tell you what the target is about to do. Webb nodded slowly. Your father developed this over how many years, he said. The framework started when I was about 6, Maddie said. He refined it continuously until he died, so about 20 years of development. The room absorbed this. 20 years, Webb said quietly, almost to himself. And the program turned it down because he didn't have a military background. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a man saying a fact aloud and letting the weight of it settle where it settled. Rourke from the back of the room said yes. One word, nothing else. And that single word from Cole Rourke, with the acknowledgement it carried and the weight of what it cost a man like him to say it in front of his team and his colleagues and the visiting advisors and Dr. Reeves with her recording phone, that single word landed in the room like something physical. Several people looked at the floor. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. Cortez, who had been quiet throughout, looked at the whiteboard and then at the map on the desk with its careful margin notations in Daniel Hale's handwriting, and his expression was the expression of a man who has understood something that makes him wish the understanding had arrived earlier. Maddie stood at the front of the room and did not fill the silence. She had learned from her father that some silences were productive, that the impulse to fill them was usually about the speaker's discomfort rather than the audience's need. She let the silence do what it needed to do. After perhaps 20 seconds, Dr. Reeves spoke. I'd like to formally request Ms. Hale's permission to document the environmental integration methodology for inclusion in our performance science research archive, she said, with full attribution to Daniel Hale as original developer and Madeline Hale as current practitioner and developer. Maddie looked at her. Yes, she said, he would have wanted that. The debrief continued. Rourke moved through the remaining agenda items: program, administrative review equipment, a return, logistics for competitors departing that afternoon. His voice was unchanged. His pace was unchanged. He was doing his job with the same flat professionalism he had maintained for 3 days. But Harker, sitting in the third row, noticed something. The tablet in Rourke's hand, the tablet that had been producing notations throughout 3 days of trial, was not producing notations. Rourke was not writing anything down. He was listening, just listening. For a man whose professional identity was built on documentation, on data, on the logged and measured and verified record, just listening was a statement of its own kind. The debrief concluded at 10:17. As people began to gather their things and push back chairs and exchange the low post-meeting conversation that follows any intense group session, Rourke crossed the room to where Maddie was refolding her father's map. He stopped beside her. She looked up. I found out why your father came here 7 years ago, Rourke said. I looked up the consultation records last night. Maddie was still. The program director at the time sent a form rejection, Rourke said. Standard language, insufficient institutional credentials. Program not positioned to implement civilian-sourced methodologies. He paused. I would have sent the same letter, he said. He said it without looking away from her, without softening it, without the protective verbal armor that people use when they're confessing something that reflects badly on them. I know, Maddie said. That doesn't make it less wrong, Rourke said. No, she agreed, it doesn't. Another pause. He applied to be a training consultant here, Rourke said. That's in the record too. He wanted to come back. After the methodology rejection, he submitted a formal consultant application 6 months later. Maddie had not known this. She kept her face still, but something in her chest moved. It was declined at the administrative level, Rourke said. It may not have even reached a decision maker, just processed out. Same reason. No military background, no institutional affiliation. He was watching her carefully. He never told you, Rourke said. No, Maddie said. She thought about her teacher in the evenings after those rejections. Making dinner, working at his desk, driving her to competitions and watching from the line with the quiet, focused attention he gave everything. Never once, not once, letting any of it become her weight to carry. He had protected her from it deliberately, so that she could simply learn, simply improve, simply be good at something because it was worth being good at, not because it was ammunition for grievance. She understood, with the full weight of it landing on her now in this briefing room in this facility that had rejected him twice, that this was the greatest thing he had ever given her. He had let her love the work without needing the work to be a weapon. She exhaled. He wasn't trying to prove them wrong, she said, and she understood as she said it that she was also talking about herself. He was trying to make the knowledge better. He just needed someone to receive it. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed something. Not the range coin, she already had that. This was smaller. A folded card, white heavy stock, the kind used for official range documentation. He held it toward her. She took it. It was a copy of his formal board response, the one he had written at 05:15 that morning before anyone else was awake. She read it standing there. It was factual, sourced, without defensiveness. It documented every phase of verification. It addressed the structural comparison argument, directly citing Pierce's own statement from the debrief, which meant Rourke had not written it before 0700, but had revised it afterward, incorporating what Pierce had said in real time. The final paragraph read, "The program's integrity is measured not by whether its results confirm existing expectations, but by whether it accurately records and learns from what occurs on this range. The result recorded for Maddie Hale on August 14th is accurate. The program's response to it must be the same." Maddie read it twice. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for doing what I should have done from the beginning," he said. Not harshly, just precisely. He turned to go. He stopped. "The methodology session," he said, "the question session I scheduled this morning. I'd like to make it a standing program element, if you're willing, not today. After you've had time, we'll work out the logistics." Maddie looked at him. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once. He left. Pierce appeared at her elbow approximately 30 seconds later, which meant he had been close enough to hear at least part of what Rourke had said and had waited with the specific patience of someone managing a strong impulse to interrupt. "Standing program element," Pierce said. "That's what he said." "You understand what that means," Pierce said. "That's not a one-time thing. That's a structural change." "I know," Maddie said. Pierce looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and mildly exasperated, which was she was beginning to understand his resting face when he encountered something he hadn't expected and couldn't dismiss. "You came here to prove one thing," he said, "and you're leaving having changed a different thing entirely." Maddie considered this. "They're the same thing," she said. Pierce thought about it. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I think you're right." The afternoon brought departures. The trial was formally concluded. Equipment was returned, travel arrangements confirmed, goodbyes, exchanged with the varied warmth of people who have spent 3 intense days together and emerged from it in different relationships than they entered. Harker shook Maddie's hand with both of his and said simply, "Your father built something real." He said it the way engineers say things, as a professional assessment, which was the highest form of respect available in his vocabulary. Ortez embraced her briefly the way men who have been in real danger embrace people they genuinely respect, and said, "I'm going to look at flags differently now." He meant it literally, and they both knew it. Webb, who had started this with the permission slip comment, who had been the sharpest early dismissal, who had uncrossed his arms in the debrief room and said the 2 words that had cost him the most, walked up last. He stood in front of her. He was not a man who apologized easily. That was visible. The struggle was visible. Maddie waited, not impatiently. "The permission slip thing," he said. "It's fine," she said. "It's not," he said. Don't have to say it's fine." Maddie looked at him. "What would you prefer I say?" she asked, and she wasn't being combative. She was genuinely asking because she understood that this moment was about his need to complete something, and she was willing to let him complete it. Webb exhaled. "I prefer you said it wasn't fine, and that you expect better from people," he said. Because you should, and because saying something stupid about a kid's age and then watching that kid shoot 21 clean head zone hits in a sandstorm, while the most experienced shooters I know are maxing out at 17, that should feel like something. It feels like something. Maddie looked at him for a moment. It wasn't fine, she said. No, he said, and I expect better from people. You should, he said, a pause. We good, he said. We're good, she said. Webb nodded. He walked away with the relieved, slightly lighter posture of someone who has settled a debt they had been carrying. General Brooks found her near the main gate as the last vehicles were preparing to depart. He was carrying a formal program envelope, which he handed to her without preamble in the way that Brooks handled most things directly, efficiently, without performance. Scholarship offer, he said. Ballistics, optics, performance science, supervised civilian program. If you finish school, you contribute to research, you continue developing the methodology under formal academic and program auspices. Daniel's work gets proper documentation and institutional backing. Maddie held the envelope. There's no recruitment component, Brooks said. You're not being asked to join anything or commit to any operational function. You're being asked to develop what you know in an environment that will support it properly. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Brooks. The program that rejected my father, she said. It's the same institutional network. It is, Brooks said. That's intentional. The same institution that was wrong should be the one that makes it right. Maddie thought about this. He would have found that, she started, and then she stopped because she wasn't sure what word came next. Satisfying, ironic, she tried a different word. He would have found that appropriate, she said. Brooks almost smiled. I think so too, he said. She put the envelope in her bag, beside the map, beside the range coin, beside the folded copy of Rourke's board response. The pickup truck that had brought her 3 mornings ago was waiting at the gate. Same driver, same total absence of questions, which she had come to actively appreciate. She put her duffel in the bed of the truck, and her rifle case beside it. She turned back toward the facility one last time. Rourke was standing near the main building entrance, not walking toward her, just standing. He had his tablet in one hand and his arms at his sides, and he was watching the gate with the expression that his face made by default, the one that revealed nothing except that it wasn't quite his default expression today. Today there was something different in it, something that was not softness exactly. Rourke didn't do softness. It was more like the particular quality that a well-used face acquires after it has processed something genuinely large. A settling, a slight realignment of the features around a new weight that had taken up permanent residence. Maddie looked at him across the distance. She raised her hand once. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. He raised his. She got in the truck. The driver pulled away from Red Mesa without asking her where she'd been or what she'd done there or how it had gone. The facility gate closed behind them. The desert opened up ahead wide and flat and permanent. The same desert it had been before she arrived and would be long after she left. She put her hand in her shirt pocket and touched the map. Her father's map, his handwriting in the margins. Red Mesa noted carefully 7 years ago by a man who had driven here with an idea and driven home in quiet and never stopped working. She looked out at the desert and thought about knowledge, what it costs to build it, what it costs to carry it when nobody is ready to receive it, and what it means when someone finally is. She thought about the range coin in her pocket, about the standing program element, about the scholarship envelope in her bag, about Pierce's nod across a briefing room, and Webb's 2 words and Rourke's 1 word, in the single sentence he had said at the door of the debrief room facing away from her, directed at the whole room but meant only for her. Your father was right. That was the thing that mattered. Not the score, though the score had been necessary. Not the diagnostic confirmation, though that had been necessary too. The thing that mattered was that a man who had spent 20 years building something true had been heard, was being heard now through the person he had spent 17 years preparing to carry it forward. That was the work. That had always been the work. The desert slid past the window and Maddie Hale sat with her hand in her pocket and the future in her bag and drove away from the place where her father's knowledge had finally found its home. 6 months pass the way 6 months pass when you are doing real work, not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific density of time that fills itself completely and leaves no empty space for wondering where it went. Maddie finished her senior year of high school in Tucson. She went to class every morning, turned in her assignments, sat for her exams, and did all of the ordinary things that 17-year-olds are supposed to do. And none of her classmates knew what had happened in the desert at Red Mesa because she had not told them. It was not a secret she kept out of modesty. It was a distinction she maintained because she understood in the way her father had understood it, that the work and the recognition of the work were two entirely separate things and only one of them mattered. The scholarship program began in January, 3 weeks after her 18th birthday. The formal title was the Maddie Hale Civilian Research Fellowship. Brooks had named it without consulting her, which she discovered when she received the official enrollment documents in the mail and sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. She had not expected that. She called Brooks. He answered on the second ring. "The name," she said. "Yes," he said. "You didn't ask me." "No," he said. "I didn't." A pause. "He earned it," Brooks said. 20 years of work that this program benefited from without acknowledging. The name is the acknowledgement. It was not my decision to make alone. I brought it to the board and the board approved it unanimously, including Colonel Whitfield, who does not approve things unanimously under ordinary circumstances. Maddie sat with this. "He would have said it was unnecessary," she said. "I know," Brooks said. "That's why I didn't ask him, and why I didn't ask you either. Because people who do the right thing without needing recognition are exactly the people who deserve to have their names on things." She did not argue with him. She said thank you, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with manners. The fellowship work was different from competition shooting. In every structural way, it was slower, more iterative, more collaborative, requiring her to translate the intuitive and physical into the documented and reproducible. Dr. Reeves led the research team, and she was precise and demanding and intellectually honest in ways that Maddie responded to immediately. They spent the first month simply documenting, writing out the environmental integration methodology in full, with all of its components, all of its decision trees, all of the variables that a practitioner needed to track simultaneously, and the training progressions by which someone could develop the capacity to track them. It was harder than shooting. Shooting Maddie knew how to do, explaining what she knew, breaking it into transferable pieces, making the implicit explicit. That was a different skill entirely, and she worked at it with the same patient intensity she brought to everything, and she got better at it, and the methodology document grew. By March, it was 47 pages. By April, it was 63. By May, 3 separate defense research programs had requested copies of the working draft. Rourke called her in April. She saw his name on her phone and paused for a half second before answering, not out of reluctance, but out of the simple surprise that his name on her phone still produced the slight reorganization of the mental landscape that comes when a person who represented one thing to you at the beginning of a story has become something different by the middle of it. "Hale," he said. "Rourke," she said. A pause on his end. "The trial redesign," he said. "The board approved the proposal. I'm building the new phase 2 around the discrimination framework you walked us through in the debrief. I need your input on the target sequencing." Maddie sat up straighter. "When do you need it?" she said. "Yesterday," he said, "but I'll take this week." "Send me the draft," she said. "Already did," he said. "Check your fellowship email." She checked. It was there. He had sent it 4 minutes before calling her, which was exactly the kind of thing Rourke would do, complete the action before announcing it, because announcing an intention you hadn't yet executed was a form of inefficiency he found genuinely offensive. She read through the draft while they were still on the phone. It was good. Structurally sound sequencing logic, clean the discrimination scenarios built with real complexity. But there were 2 places where the friendly marker scenarios were too legible, where the posture coding made the non-engagement call easier than it would be in genuine ambiguity, she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Show me," he said. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which was she had learned in the 6 months since the trial. Actually, one of Rourke's genuine qualities: when he decided to listen, he listened completely. The interrupting he had done on the range during phase 1 had been a test, not a habit. The real Rourke, the one doing actual work, went quiet and let information arrive in full. When she finished, he said, "You're right. Both of those need to be harder. The second one especially," she said. "If the target's posture gives it away at that distance, you're not testing judgment. You're testing vision." "Agreed," he said. "I'll revise and send back." Another pause. "The program is calling the redesigned trial the Hale Protocol," he said internally. "It may become the formal designation." Maddie was quiet. Nobody asked me about that either, she said. No, Rourke said. I imagine Brooks has a pattern. And there it was, the first time Cole Rourke had made anything approaching a dry observation in her presence. It arrived so unexpectedly that she almost didn't recognize it for what it was. He does, she said. The name is accurate, Rourke said, returning to his default register. It describes the thing. That's what names should do. He ended the call. Maddie sat with her phone in her hand and the fellowship email open on her laptop in the April sunlight coming through the window of her apartment, a small place near the university which she had moved into 2 months earlier, and she thought about her father. She thought about the fact that he had applied twice to this program, that both applications had been declined, that he had gone home both times without bitterness, had cooked dinner, had kept working. And now his methodology was being taught at the program that had turned him away under a fellowship bearing his name embedded in a redesigned trial that would carry his daughters. It was not justice exactly. Justice would have required him to be alive to see it. It was something else. Something that didn't have a clean word, but felt like completion, the closing of a loop that had been open for 20 years. Its ends finally brought together by the accumulated weight of work that had refused to stop being true regardless of whether anyone was willing to receive it. She closed the laptop. She went to her desk and opened the drawer where she kept the things from Red Mesa. The range coin, the copy of Rourke's board response still folded along the original lines, and her father's map, the Red Mesa map, with his margin notations, which she had transferred from her shirt pocket to this drawer on the night she returned from the trial, in which she had not moved since, because this was where it belonged now. Not in a range bag, not in a shirt pocket, in a drawer in her desk, in the apartment where she did the ongoing work of making sure what he had built continued forward. She picked up the map, unfolded it along his crease lines. She found the note he had written in the margin the day he visited Red Mesa 7 years ago. She had read it many times. She read it again. Wind reads true if you know where to look. The range is never lying to you. It's waiting for the right question. She folded the map back along his lines. She put it in the drawer. She closed it, and she went back to work. The first demonstration of the redesigned trial ran on a Tuesday in late September, 18 months after the original trial. Rourke had scheduled it for a smaller group, 8 participants, a mix of program veterans and new admissions, plus a panel of observers that included Reeves Whitfield and 2 additional defense research advisors who had followed the methodology documentation process since April. Pierce was there. He had requested inclusion specifically, which Rourke had confirmed without comment, which was Rourke's version of being pleased. Cortez was there too in an official capacity. He had been brought on as an adjunct training consultant 3 months earlier in the first formal expansion of the program's civilian expertise component. He stood at the range with the quiet authority of someone who has found the professional environment where they actually belong. And Maddie stood at the range alongside Rourke, not as a competitor, not as a subject of evaluation, as a junior technical advisor. The program had issued her credentials. They had her name on a badge. They had scheduled her on the range calendar as a standing presence. All of these were bureaucratic facts, small and administrative, and each one of them would have seemed entirely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it had taken to get here. Pierce knew. He arrived that morning and found her already at the range reviewing wind data with Garrett, who had become, in the months since the trial, a genuine student of environmental integration, and who had printed out a laminated reference card of the methodology's visual cues that he kept in his range kit. Pierce watched them work for a moment before announcing his presence. Then he walked over. "Junior Technical Advisor," he said, reading her badge with an expression that couldn't fully suppress what was underneath it. "That sounds like a title someone invented, because there wasn't an existing category." "There wasn't," Maddie said. "Brooks created it?" "Of course he did," Pierce said. He paused. "It fits." She looked at him. "How are you?" he said, and he meant it as a real question. Across the months since the trial, they had exchanged messages, occasionally short, specific professional exchanges about methodology questions he had encountered in his own training work, which she answered with the same directness she applied to everything. But he hadn't seen her in person since the facility gate on the last afternoon. "I'm good," she said. "The fellowship is," she paused, choosing the word. "It's right, it's the right work." Pierce nodded. He looked at the range, at the redesigned target array that the range staff had configured for the demonstration. He had reviewed the new Phase 2 structure in a briefing document Rourke had circulated 2 weeks earlier. You made the discrimination scenarios harder, he said. The original design was too legible, she said. If you can read the correct answer from posture alone, you're not testing judgment. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Target 3, he said, day 2 of the original trial, the shadow read. Yes, she said, that's in the new design. That level of ambiguity is the baseline, and she said, not the hard case, the baseline. Pierce absorbed this. That's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, he said. Yes, she said, it should be. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said, it should. Rourke called the group to the demonstration briefing at 0900. He ran it with his standard flat efficiency, covering the new structure, the new scoring parameters, the new weighting of observation and restraint relative to speed. He explained the rationale for each change in factual documented terms. When he reached the observation and patience components, the elements that most directly reflected Maddie Hale's original methodology, he paused. He looked at the group. The previous structure rewarded speed and decisiveness as primary virtues, he said. The revised structure recognizes that in high ambiguity environments, the most important capability is the ability to gather sufficient information before acting. Speed applied to insufficient information produces confident errors. This program previously optimized for speed. We are revising that optimization. He paused. This revision is based on methodology developed by Maddie Hale, a civilian practitioner over 20 years. It was presented to this program 7 years ago. The program declined to implement it. That was an error, and this redesign is the correction. He said all of this with the same tone he used for ammunition counts and sensor specifications. No drama, no qualification, just a man stating a fact about what happened and what was being done about it. The group received it in silence. Then Rourke turned toward Maddie. It was the same motion he had made at the original debrief, a deliberate turn, a direct look, a transfer of floor in a room where he controlled the floor. Miss Hale will now demonstrate the environmental assessment component, he said. Pay attention. This is the part of precision marksmanship that this program has historically undertaught. Maddie stepped forward. She stood in front of the group, 8 new participants. Pierce, Cortez, Garrett, Dr. Reeves, Whitfield, 2 defense advisors, and she looked at the range for a moment before speaking. The canyon was visible from here. The flag near the north ridge was doing what it always did, oscillating in its particular pattern, the surface reading and the compressed channel reading, creating the inconsistency that she had identified on the first morning of the original trial, and that had been the foundation of everything that followed. She pointed at the flag. That flag, she said, is telling the truth. It's just not telling the whole truth. She had said those words before. On the last morning of the original trial to Rourke, standing on this same range. He had studied the mirage after she said them and finally seen the hidden crosswind. Now she said them to a room full of people who had not been there that morning, and she explained what they meant and what they pointed to and what you had to learn to see before you could understand what the range was actually saying. Pierce listened from the back of the group with his arms at his sides and his full attention on her. Not the watching he had done on the first day, the assessing, categorizing watching of a man who has already decided what he's looking at. The listening of someone who understands that the person in front of him knows something he doesn't and who has made the specific choice to close that gap. It was the most important kind of watching there was. And Rourke stood in the side of the range, and he had his tablet in his right hand, and for the second time in the history of their acquaintance, he was not making notations on it. He was just listening. The demonstration ran for 2 hours. Maddie walked the group through the full environmental assessment process, the visual data points, the integration method, the decision architecture, the specific practice progressions that a shooter needed to develop the simultaneous awareness the system required. She answered every question, corrected every misunderstanding, and held the room's attention without effort because she was not performing knowledge. She was simply sharing it the way her father had always shared it, as something that existed to be used not to impress. At the end, Rourke gathered the group for a closing debrief. He stood at the front of the range with his tablet, still quiet in his hand. Questions, he said. Whitfield raised his. The documentation, the fellowship is planning a formal publication. Yes, Rourke said. De Reeves is leading. Expected publication in the Defense Research Archive within the year. with a practitioner's guide to be distributed to all affiliated training programs. Whitfield nodded. After one of the new participants, a young man who had been listening with the focused, somewhat overwhelmed attention of someone receiving more information than they had anticipated, raised his hand. "How long does it take," he said, "to develop the full integration capability, to actually be able to do what she just described?" Rourke looked at him. Then Rourke looked at Maddie. It was the deliberate look of a man who was choosing to cede the answer to someone else, which was not something Cole Rourke did casually or often. Maddie looked at the young man. "My father started teaching me at 6, she said. "I didn't run a complete 3-layer integration until I was 14. It took 8 years of daily practice." She paused. "But every piece of it is learnable, every single piece. The capacity isn't born, it's built." The young man nodded slowly. "How do you start?" he said. Maddie thought about her father, about a field behind a house, about a .22 rifle and targets at varying distances, and a voice in her ear saying, "Don't look at the target, look at everything between you and the target." "You start by looking at the flag," she said, "and then you ask it what it's not telling you." The group was quiet, and then Rourke did something that nobody present would forget. He walked to the equipment table near the range control station. He opened his tablet, and he turned it toward the group so that everyone could see the screen, the scoring display from the original trial which he had saved and which he brought up now, deliberately, methodically, with the care of a man presenting evidence in a case he believes in completely. 21 head zone hits, 0 penalties. Everyone in the group who had been at the original trial recognized it immediately. The new participants looked at the numbers without the context of having watched them accumulate in real time, but the numbers spoke without context. Then Rourke reached into his jacket and removed something else. A scoring card, the kind the program issued for every trial run, the kind with the competitor's name and phase results and the official range stamp. He held it up. It was Maddie's card from the original trial, and on it, above the score, was a line of handwriting, Rourke's handwriting, the same precise economical script he used on his notations. Where there had once been the dismissive placeholder notation he had written, on the first morning he had crossed it out, completely. A single clean line through whatever he had originally written, and in its place in his careful handwriting, 21 confirmed hits, 0 penalties, judgment beyond her years. He handed it to her across the distance between them. She took it. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He had said everything that needed to be said in the 3 days of that trial and the 6 months that followed, and the 2 hours of this demonstration, and the single line of handwriting on a scoring card that she would keep for the rest of her life alongside a map with her father's notes in the margins. She folded the card carefully along a line that would not damage the writing. She put it in her pocket, and Cole Rourke turned back to his group and said, "Range is open. Let's work." And that was the end of the ceremony and the beginning of the practice, which was exactly how it should be. Pierce fell in a step beside Maddie as they moved toward the range. 20 years, he said quietly. "Your father spent 20 years building that, and they turned it down twice. And now it has his name on a fellowship and her name on a protocol, and a room full of the best precision shooters in the country just spent 2 hours learning it." Maddie walked beside him and said nothing. "Does that feel like enough?" Pierce said. Not challenging, genuinely asking the way a person asks when they want to know how someone carries something this large. Maddie thought about it. She thought about her father driving home from this facility in the quiet, about dinner that night, about the maps he kept filling with careful notations in the faith that knowledge, that work, deserved to keep existing. "It's not about enough," she said. "He didn't build it to be vindicated. He built it because it was true and because true things deserve to exist." She paused. "My job isn't to make sure he gets enough credit. My job is to make sure the work keeps going." Pierce walked beside her. "That's a hard job," he said. "No," she said. "It's the right job. Those aren't the same thing." They reached the range. The flag near the North Canyon was oscillating in its particular pattern, the surface current and the compressed channel arguing with each other in the way they had always argued, in the way they would keep arguing long after everyone on this range was gone, the wind telling its layered truth to anyone who had learned to ask the right question. Maddie looked at the flag. She looked at the range stretched out before her, at the targets in their positions, at the dust and the heat and the physical fact of the place. her father had come to twice and been turned away from twice, and whose ground his methodology now lived inside of permanently. She picked up her equipment. She stepped to the line. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be recognized before they begin. Daniel Hale never waited. He built in the dark, in the quiet, in the patient faith that what was true would eventually find the light it deserved. His daughter had carried it into that light, and now it burned steadily, and it would not go out, and no one who had seen it would be able to look at a range flag the same way again. That was the work. That had always been enough.